Hello, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all my dear friend, Pam DeLargy, who's going to be our keynote speaker. Pam and I first met back in the early 1990s in Asmara, Eritrea. And she was working for USAID, and I was a consultant sponsored in part by USAID, trying to get Eritrea off on the right track. You know, I did presentations at their Constitutional Convention. I also participated in the beginning again of the University of Asmara. And Pam and her husband, Craig, graciously invited me to come and have dinner with her and some friends in Eritrea, and we've been friends ever since. It was, those were heady times in Eritrea, and I guess you can imagine, because they had just gone through 30 years of war for independence from Ethiopia, which they saw as a colonizer. And this was the end of it, and people were very happy about that situation. Pam now lives in Los Angeles, and we're very lucky to have her here with us in this community because she deals with issues that we are deeply concerned with as well, deeply concerned with and want to do more about, and those are the issues of refugees and migrants. Pam got her Master's of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, although she was also trained as a political scientist. And since then, she's been heavily involved in doing humanitarian work that particularly addresses the plight of African women and youth in the Horn of Africa. Most recently, she's been involved with the United Nations as Special Advisor to the UN Representative for Migration, and also while at the London School of Economics recently, about a year ago, Pam contributed to their special series, African Perspectives on Migration. In this piece, Pam gave an overview of irregular migrants from Africa to Europe. And I'm sure she'll say a little bit about that in her presentation today. Today, what she's going to address is ideas about how research and data link in both policy and practice. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Pam DeLargy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you to the organizers of this Going Global conference. I was able to see a few of the presentations this morning, and I was very impressed at how some of the students here were able to put a big wealth of information and ideas into a very small space. I'm not as good at that as you were. But so I had to rethink a little bit what I wanted to say today. First of all, I just want to say that we are not holding Ed Keller responsible for Eritrea going off the track, for the Constitution, which is a beautiful Constitution, being put in the drawer. So Ed, you're okay on that. I'm going to say a few words this morning, just kind of bringing in some of my own experiences and ideas about issues of research, and also about some of the interesting contrast between humanitarian work and human rights work. You're focused here on human rights primarily, and you've been looking at migration and populism and xenophobia and all this kind of thing. And all of these are tremendous problems. But I think there are a few other things that deserve a little bit of research. And this is the place to do it, obviously. So many of the problems that you've already talked about, serious global problems. There seems to be, as Pope Francis has put it, kind of globalization of xenophobia right now. Are spreading, are serious, have huge human rights implications, have huge implications for the need for humanitarian response, have big implications for democracy altogether, right? It's ironic that at a time when we have more and better sort of technological solutions to problems, we don't have a commensurate understanding of the social or cultural or political solutions that we need right now. And this is especially in the area of human rights and humanitarianism. I started out as an academic and then just couldn't resist the call of doing something more practical, as they say. But have always been kind of a hybrid and a problem in the humanitarian community and NGO and UN system, because I kept saying, but the research shows, when a lot of people didn't want to hear that, and a problem in the academic community saying, but you have to explain that in a way that people can understand it better so that policymakers can hear what you're saying. But now, as I'm older, I think, hey, this is a pretty good combination. And I was very lucky to have an academic background. I was in political science and then later in public health and demography. Part of the reason I left political science, and this is also no indictment of Ed Keller, but that I thought it was the one discipline that should be the most interesting discipline in the world, and it was the most tedious at that time. Voting behavior studies, systems theory, love Emmanuel, but come on. Arms race models, you guys are too young to remember arms race models, I think. A lot of Cold War stuff. I mean, it should be really interesting, right? Poli-sci, it was just so awful. So I was pulled to some things more interesting. And I'm going to start with a story just to illustrate this. I actually went to Sudan to do my own dissertation research, which was on the integration of Ethiopian and Eritrean and other refugees in Sudan at the time. This was a time when there were lots and lots of refugees in Sudan. It was probably the world's biggest host of refugees then. And it was during the famine in the 1980s. You're all too young to remember that too, but I'll tell you that this was a very, very famous famine. And it was well publicized, even before there was real social media coverage or anything. It was one of the first real disasters to reach into the media. Famous film from Ethiopia on the famine just mobilized everything, you may remember the We Are the World concert, all the involvement of artists and musicians and others to try to raise awareness of what was going on in the Horn of Africa and across the Sahel. I just happened to be there doing my dissertation research, and I was working as a volunteer in the Sudanese Refugee Commission when this famine struck, and there was a massive logistics response. Food airlifts, just a huge influx of expatriate humanitarian workers, NGOs, the UN, US, everybody was there in Sudan, along with all the refugees. And it was a very interesting and kind of disturbing time for me because I could see huge amount of money, huge amount of activity, a lot of logistics. That was back when humanitarian response was pretty much a cowboy enterprise. It was a bunch of guys, a bunch of planes, a lot of trucks, and a lot of loading up of stuff onto the planes or onto the trucks, and then delivery. Water, a lot of water being brought in and everything. And it was odd to me because I was sort of, at the same time I was interacting with these people and watching this story, I was working at the Refugee Commission, which kind of led me to working actually at the Sudanese Environmental Institute. And working at the Environmental Institute, met some amazing Sudanese and other geographers, environmental specialists, etc., who led me to understand this famine in a very different way. And that this was not about, gee, it didn't rain for 2 years. This was about a huge amount of environmental degradation that had gone on because of agricultural policies in the Sudan. Massive, huge farms, a lot of plowing, a lot of desertification. And that was happening across the Sahel, and it got me very interested in the geography of this, in the activity, in the agricultural activity, the impact on pastoralists, what was happening to pastoralism, what was happening to people as they were forced to move to other places and then displaced other people. This would later come back to haunt Sudan and Darfur, which is something you may have heard a lot more about it. But there was a kind of disconnect between the response and the notion of people had a right to eat and a right to food, and there was at that time kind of discussions of human rights, but not a lot of details. And I happened to have a colleague there he was also young at the time, and he was an anthropologist and doing his work in Darfur, on the Darfur, and studying the history of the Darfur people and looking at what was happening in Darfur, and his name is Alex Dewall. And Alex was doing his dissertation too at the time on the Darfur, and then came out of that his famous book called Famine That Kills, which was one of the first really good on-the-ground research ethnographies and analysis of what happens during a famine, and the response and the politics of it and the cultural aspects of it. And that was at the same time that Amartya Sen also was reminding us that famine is not a natural disaster. Famine is a man-made disaster. And it struck me that this is a good example because I was struggling with, seeing all these guys from the World Food Program talking about this and this and this, who had no clue about the history of Sudan, what was happening in Darfur, the agricultural policy, the environmental degradation, no clue at all about this. And that it's so important for doing good humanitarian response to understand what is going on, and vice versa. It was bedlam, but it was ironic because many of people who became the leaders in the UN system later got their start during that famine, either in Ethiopia or Sudan. Mark Malloch Brown, Sergio de Mello, so many of the big names who became heads of UN agencies, heads of humanitarian thinking globally, all started out in Sudan. It was a kind of fraternity, and I mean that literally. Since then, there's been a professionalization of humanitarianism and humanitarian response and of human rights work. And human rights work has come a long, long way. Theory of human rights, practice, people going out and assisting, legal support, conceptualization of rights, expansion of thinking about rights. And along with that came a kind of sort of parallel thing happening with humanitarian law and happening with human rights law. These are very different things. The expansion in thinking about human rights also led to the rethinking of humanitarianism, about who we have to think about in a humanitarian emergency, right? The development of standards. Wait a minute, we have to be able to measure this. We have to have people being accountable. We have to know what we're doing. We have to be more efficient. We have to spend money better, more effectively, because you can waste a lot of money in a big humanitarian response. And we have to make it more predictable and more accountable, both to the beneficiaries, that's a terrible word, but that's what's used, and to the donors. And in this huge effort to sort of make things more accountable and professionalize and everything, there were development of standards and new financing mechanisms and all of this. Some of you may know about these. Now we have something every year called a Common Humanitarian Appeal. Used to be every group, Save the Children, UNHCR, the Jesuit Relief Services, they all appealed for their own money for something. So you had a lot of gaps in the humanitarian program, and you had a lot of overlap. Now, everybody's forced to work together in a country, and they come together and they prioritize and they decide who's going to do what, and then the donors are happier giving money to a common fund that then gets distributed. That has created its own bureaucracy, but it's still interesting. And then there's a central emergency response fund, and there was many years of discussion about what is considered life-saving. Like donors give money to a big fund at the UN, Emergency Response Fund, and that can be used in a quick emergency. You don't have to do proposals and everything. But there was a list, of course, World Food Program, food, UNICEF, water, sanitation. And I was at the time with the UN Population Fund, and we said maternal health. And the cowboy said, huh? I don't think so. Wait a minute. Maternal health? What are you talking about? Ah, this is where your research comes in. So, it wasn't too hard to draw on the public health community and those who were working in maternal health and those who were working in women's health to show the terrible birth outcomes in emergency situations when women lost access to emergency obstetric care. And there we worked with a lot of schools of public health to show, hey, look what happened here. People lost access, this and that. We had this many premature births of babies who died. We had this many miscarriages. We have this many, maternal deaths in this situation. And because there was also at the time a human rights, focus on women and women's health and women's rights, it really helped us to get that, oh, okay. So finally, we had to negotiate, and I had a wonderful head of UNFPA at that time, Dr. Nafis Sadiq, wonderful Pakistani physician from the military there who was tough as nails in the UN system. And so, guess what? Okay, emergency obstetric care became part of something that could be considered for the Emergency Relief Fund. And we won that fight. We had a kind of coalition to do it. And then, now imagine me in Timor, in East Timor, negotiating with the World Food Program guys who are loading the trucks with food to go up in the mountains going, would you guys mind taking some menstrual supplies? This was like, what? This is not important. This is not life-saving. This is not, again, we pulled on the human rights community and the other community and showed through research that had been done in a number of countries that when women don't have access to menstrual supplies, they cannot go out and stand in the line in the food distribution because it's a stigma to be out there. So bit by bit, utilizing knowledge, research, and information, we got menstrual supplies on that list. Then there was a very interesting aspect. Like I was working in reproductive health and we were going HIV. Oh no, said the community. You can't be thinking about HIV in emergencies. That's a luxury. That's a long-term issue. But there was a lot of research at the time, some great research showing that conflict and displacement was a direct contributor to the spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. So that helped too. We got condoms included. And then later, in the World Health Organization, Paul Spiegel, a colleague there who's at Hopkins now, they proved that you can actually continue ARV programs in refugee camps. Because early on, the cowboys were saying, no, that's a luxury. You can't be thinking about that. We're saying, wait a minute. Somebody's on ARVs in Cameroon, and they flee across the border to Central African Republic, and they stop the ARVs, that is a death sentence. It became categorized as life-saving intervention. So I'm giving these examples just to show that you're sort of moving in tandem with the human rights recognition and expansion there of thinking about that. Then came the big scandals in ex-Yugoslavia, in Congo on sexual violence. And this was something that was very difficult to deal with because it's my organization was the one that actually provides the clinical response for survivors of rape. And the medical supplies and the training and all that was not considered something that was part of humanitarian response. That, of course, wasn't such a hard battle because it became such a big issue in the media, especially the Congolese situation, but also the situation in Bosnia and other situations such as that. But it was interesting because there we saw an example that it became a very sensationalized topic. And there was a lot of attention to issues of rape in conflict and sexual violence in conflict. And there was a huge amount of money thrown at it at the time. And some of this was really wasted because people didn't really know the dynamics of sexual violence and conflict and who was liable to be vulnerable and this and that. And it took Libby Woods at Yale to do a really tough analysis of this and say, whoa, quit saying that this is inevitable in a conflict. It is not. There are certain kinds of conflicts in which it's more likely and others that it's not. And so I'm just saying to link these, the research has been very important all of this time. But it's interesting too, as we look at people, as we look at populations affected by a crisis more closely, we see there are people with disabilities, there are elderly people, there are people with other kinds of mental health needs. And all of this actually kind of expanded. As the human rights thinking expanded on this, so did the humanitarian response there. But, I have to do quickly here, there are also interesting tensions between human rights work and humanitarianism. Because the principles of humanitarianism are what? Neutrality, impartiality, and providing assistance on the basis of need and need alone. Now, you can immediately think, what does that mean for Hutu who fled from Rwanda into Goma? And the humanitarian community was frantically trying to provide food and clothing, and within these groups are the genocidaires. What does it mean when you're in the civil war and you've got people recruiting refugees in camps and this and that, and you know that if you're giving food in this camp, some of that food is going to go to the militias there. So there also became some interesting conflicts. I'll give an example from the Darfur crisis. We knew that there was some sexual violence going on there, and by this time there were standards, and if a woman shows up and you know she's been raped, you provide post-exposure HIV prophylaxis. That was the standard and the norm. You're supposed to provide, counseling, physical health care, et cetera, et cetera. But in Sudan, when women were showing up, and there were NGOs like Save the Children, International Rescue Committee, or all of these others there, and they had clinics. They were the ones running the health services. There was all this discussion about the post-exposure prophylaxis. well, wait a minute, we have this, that. The government of Sudan had a different protocol. But actually HIV wasn't very common there. So my argument there, I was head of humanitarian response for UNFPA, then is forget that. Because we cannot count on the woman coming back and having follow-up there. And it was all this whole, but that's the standard, that's the guideline. And again, we had to go and look at the research community using the research that had been done in the public health school there in Sudan to show, okay, this is not a threat here. But the interesting aspect was in Sudan, there was a law that said that any woman who showed up who had been raped to have a doctor treat her, the doctor had to fill out something called a Form 8. And that was a form that provided information to the police that this woman had been assaulted sexually, and et cetera, who was, when it happened, where it happened, and everything. It was required for medical treatment. And this was very controversial because the NGOs that were providing the medical treatment were going, wait a minute, the government is the bad guy here. The police are complicit in this. We can't possibly require the medics to fill out this form. So the medics quit filling out the form. And then it became a big issue with the government. And then some of them were deported, et cetera, et cetera. And then it became a big hullabaloo, even in the UN in New York. This is terrible. The Sudanese government is making doctors fill out this form to give to the police. This is purposeful harassment of women. This is purposeful perpetuation of the marginalization of the people in Darfur. But guess what? It was the Sudanese Women's Union that had fought to have that Form 8. It was a human rights battle in Sudan to have that, because previously, culturally, historically, a situation of rape would mean a negotiation between two families. You either marry the girl so she's not stigmatized or do something. And there was an exchange of money or a kind of reparations. The state did not get involved. And it was Sudanese women who had insisted that this is a crime. And this has to be treated as any other crime. And the state has to be involved. And the police have to be involved. Otherwise, you end up leaving it to families who then don't want a stigmatized daughter, so they will marry her off to the person who assaulted her. And so I think that's an interesting example of where the human rights work was sort of up against, what we were thinking of on humanitarian issues. But then the issue came, an interesting thing, the accountability aspect. Like IRC or the other NGOs who were treating women were keeping statistics, right? Because the donors required this. We're paying you money, you have to tell us how many you've treated, how many so-and-sos you filed and everything. And then when the Sudanese government realized that these groups were keeping statistics, which had been asked for by the International Criminal Court to prosecute Omar al-Bashir or the government or other people there as criminal, as evidence in a criminal trial, it became very dangerous for the clinics who were keeping the statistics. And eventually every single one of them was kicked out of the country. And we lost something like 10 NGOs who had been providing 80% of the health care in IDP camps in Darfur. So that was another interesting debate about how do you deal with the impartiality, neutrality, this and that. I think maybe they're giving me a time limit here. So just to come back to something about research right now on migration, just a few quick words. I was working very much on the cross-Mediterranean migration for the past few years. And a lot of the response of the European Union now, well, you heard some this morning, the Danish response and all of that, has been to decide, hey, we got to keep these migrants where they are. And they're throwing a lot of money at this. And an interesting case, they've thrown money, let's create employment opportunities for people in West Africa so that the Senegalese and Nigerians and Gambians aren't coming and crossing. Let's support the border forces and border management and immigration systems in East Africa so people aren't coming there. But it's so interesting because the policy is absolutely the worst policy, both in a human rights notion and also in development notions that one could imagine, because their assumption is that it is the poorest to migrate, and it is never the poorest to migrate. Any migration researcher knows this. So they're tossing a lot of money there, but the numbers are increasing. How strange, right? They're giving money to the Sudanese and the Eritrean border guards and authorities, which is actually increasing the resources of oppressive regimes who are actually the ones forcing people to leave. So I'm coming back to this need for you guys to do some more research on this. And every policy that's been adopted in the EU has been absolutely the opposite of what you would adopt if you wanted a different outcome. If you don't let asylum seekers work, that was fine when they had to wait 4 weeks for their asylum hearing, but now they have to wait 4 years in the UK for an asylum hearing. And so they're not working. So they're just sitting on the stoop, smoking a cigarette or something, which then causes the people in the neighborhood to go, wait a minute, these people just came here to take our resources and be on the dole. Obviously they're not even working, they're not interested in working, which has sort of, so you have a policy there that has fed the xenophobia. And I could give you 10 more examples of exactly that in the UK, but I think I'll just wind it up here and ask a question here. You talked about a lot of conventions this morning. What do conventions mean when citizens of a country that has signed a convention don't support them or don't even know about them? How can we, as researchers or as activists or as believers in human rights, explain information that we get from our own research in a way that is better understood by the media or better understood by your neighbor or your Aunt Sophie, right? I think this is the biggest challenge, and I was encouraged this morning because I thought, I hope this isn't going to be one of those cases where people are just presenting and it's very dry and it's all full of jargon and all that, but it wasn't. It was great. You guys did an amazing job in 9 minutes explaining something very interesting. So I congratulate you for that, and please keep up the good work. Thanks.